I'm not who you think I am. Whoa.
All right, so we're going to look at the DARCOM, the Daniel and Revelation Committee scholarly work, and we're going to look at a subsection of it. It is, let's see, selected studies on prophetic interpretation. Let's see, by William Shea. We're going to look at why Antiochus IV is not the little horn of Daniel 8. Significance of interpretation. The vision described in Daniel 8 may be outlined as follows, briefly as follows. The Persian ram appeared in the vision first, conquering to the north, west, and south, verses 3 and 4. The Grecian goat with its principal horn came on the scene of action next. By defeating the Persian ram, it became the dominant power in view, verses 5 and through 7. After reaching this position, however, the principal horn of the goat was broken, and 4 horns extending out of the 4 winds of heaven came up in its place, verse 8. Commentators concur that the contents of the vision thus far are relatively straightforward, since these 4 horns can be identified readily with the 4 kings and kingdoms derivative from them, who divided the empire conquered by Alexander. The interpretation of the next main element in the vision is more controversial. Another horn, a little horn, which came either from one of the 4 winds or from one of the 4 horns, appeared on the scene. The attack which this horn launched was not directed so much against other beasts or kingdom as against God's people, identified here as the host of stars in verses 10 and 24. It was also directed against God's work of redemption in the form of the Tamid, or daily, or continual, and the temple, verses 11 and 12, and against God's principal representative, the Prince of the host, or the Prince of Princes, verses 11 and verse 25. Clearly, this is Michael from Jeremiah 5 or Joshua 5. Daniel then heard 2 heavenly beings discussing what he had seen. One asked the other, "For how long is the vision concerning the Tamid, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" The answer given was, "Unto 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed, restored." Crucial to the interpretation of Daniel 8, verses 9 through 14, is the identification of the little horn, which is to do all of these things against God and his people. I'll read Daniel 8, 9 through 14. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified him even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Sacrifice being added. It's not in the original Hebrew, it's just the daily. Preterists are committed to the view that the majority of the prophecies of the book of Daniel have already been fulfilled, and therefore have no significance for the present day. Thus, they hold that the little horn rose from one of the divisions of Alexander's empire. They conclude that the activities of the little horn unmistakably point to Antiochus Epiphanes. Futurists generally follow this line of interpretation also. In addition, they see Antiochus as a type of an end-time Antichrist who is to arise in the final years of Earth's history before Christ's second advent. Historicists on the other hand, declare that the prophecies in Daniel portray an outline of human and ecclesiastical history and the story of the struggle between good and evil down to the end of time. Since a flow of history appears to be involved here, especially when this chapter is compared with the previous one, the historicist holds the little horn represents Rome in its pagan and papal phases. Just as there are three main identifications for the little horn, so three main applications have been made of the time period referred to in this passage. Preterists have proposed that the 2300 evening mornings should be interpreted as 2300 individual morning and evening sacrifices, or 1150 days. These should be applied to events in the career of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, 163 or 168 or something, BC. Utilizing the day for a year principle, historicists have held that that datum refers to a period of 2300 years, which began sometime in the 5th century BC and ended in the 19th century AD, 1844. As a type of the work of the final Antichrist, some futurists have applied the evening and mornings as literal evenings and mornings, or 2300 days, which they claim have not yet begun because the final manifestation of an Antichrist belongs to the future. How is this prophecy dealing with the sanctuary to be interpreted? Preterists claim it refers to the purification of the temple in Jerusalem, which was polluted by Antiochus in the 2nd century BC. Since the earthly temple was destroyed in AD 70, and this prophetic time period extends beyond this datum, historicists see it a reference to the temple in heaven. As the principal representatives of the historicists thought, the Seventh-day Adventists have understood the cleansing of Daniel 8:14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days in the KJV, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, as a reference to the heavenly antitype of the cleansing of the earthly sanctuary, which occurred in ancient Israel on the Day of Atonement. Since this was a day of judgment in Israel, the antitypical cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary has been interpreted as the time for a pre-Advent investigative judgment of God's people. This position is quite different from that of the interpreters of the futurist school, who hold that during the final 7 years of Earth's history, a literal temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem will be polluted by an antichrist. How that works, I do not know. It will be cleansed or restored when Christ comes and puts an end to the nefarious reign. These three views on the interpretation of the various elements in Daniel 8:9-14 may be summarized as follows. So, regarding the little horn, which is the top line, the 2300 days, the temple in view, and the cleansing and what is in view for each view. Well, the preterist and often the futurists believe the little horn in Daniel 8 is Antiochus or a future Antichrist, and we believe it's Rome. 2300 days, literal days for the futurists and the preterists, which are wrong, which are for reasons I've already described, and prophetic years for the historicist. How do they understand the temple? Well, the earthly. Futurists thinks there's going to be an earthly one that's desecrated by Antichrist putting a stop to animal sacrifices, I guess. Doesn't make any sense. At least the preterists can say it was before the new covenant came that this will happen. That if that refers to the future, in other words, although this is Daniel 8, not Daniel 9. Cleansing from past defilement before the new covenant, after for the futurist, and it just represents judgment of God's people starting in 1844. A pre-Advent judgment, investigative, as it were, judgment. This brief review of the various interpretations as proposed by the three main schools of prophetic interpretation make it clear that widely varying conclusions concerning the nature of the events predicted in this passage of prophecy have been reached. Of particular importance in this study is the nature of the event that is to occur at the end of the 2300 days. This is the critical difference here. If one follows the first school of thought, the prescribed purification was all completed before January 1st in 164 BC. If one follows the second line of interpretation, it refers to a judgment going on now in heaven. This has not yet happened according to the third view. When it does, events in Jerusalem and Israel will be involved. Considering the magnitude of these differences in interpretation and the importance of the events to which they refer, it is evident that these verses in Daniel need to be carefully examined. They demand our closest attention. In order to properly evaluate the passage dealing with the little horn in Daniel 8, it is necessary to understand it in the context of the book. This is because the prophecies of Daniel parallel each other to a large extent, which Daniel 7 and 8 are like a parallel of the kingdoms from Daniel 2. Consequently, a sound procedure would be to examine the prophecies of chapters 7, 9, 11, and 12, where they are relevant to the discussion. Daniel 7. If we inquire the various schools of interpretation as to how they identify the different beasts of Daniel 7, we will discover that all are agreed that the lion represents Babylon. The historicist and futurist schools identify the bear as Medo-Persia, while the preterist school, which is essentially comprised of critical scholars, identifies it as Media only. Thus, while the historicist and futurist schools continue in the sequence to identify the leopard and the nondescript beast as Greece and Rome, the preterist lags one step behind, splitting up Medes and Persians as two separate empires. Therefore, the fourth is being Greece instead of Rome. Historicists and futurists finally diverge when they come to the little horn. The former identify it as the papal horn, which came out of pagan Rome. The latter, holding to a gap in the flow of prophetic history, identify it as the final and still future Antichrist. Since they end their fourth beast series with Greece, preterists identify the little horn growing out of this beast as Antiochus. And because they think it's a future Antichrist, they put the death of Christ outside of the 70 weeks and are therefore denying Christ as the Messiah, as the book lays out he needs to be. His death would have to be in the 70 weeks in order for him to fulfill the prophecy. So those who think Jesus died outside the 70 weeks are denying Jesus is the Messiah, whether they like it or not, if they're Bible-believing Christians. There are, of course, variations in the app. I'm not gonna mince words anymore about it. That's just the facts. Sorry. You got to get Jesus in those 70 weeks or you don't have a Messiah, according to the text. There are, of course, variations in the applications made by individual commentators within each of these schools of prophetic interpretation. Until you give me an argument, anyways, so how that shouldn't matter. You can show me how that doesn't matter, but it's just clear as a bell to me. If you put Jesus' death outside of the 70 weeks, you have no Messiah, according to the Bible. But these variations are not of real significance to us here. The essential difference for our present purpose is the divergence that has developed over the interpretation of the second beast and the consequences that flow from the divergence into the interpretation of the subsequent beast nations. By dividing Media from Persia, preterists have shortened this prophetic scheme to the point where Antiochus developed out of the Grecian beast as the little horn in the 2nd century BC. The other main scheme, which identifies the second beast as a joint symbol for the combined kingdom of Media and Persia, ends one historical step farther down the road with Rome as the fourth beast. These schemes and this particular difference can be outlined as in this diagram here. Lion, bear, leopard, nondescript beast, little horn. You can see how preterists are. They spread out Media and Persia rather than the right answer, which is this. Since the interpretation, and no wonder, right? Because Rome invented this view, I'd say. Since the interpretation and this view, these beast nations must be identified before an interpretation can be proposed for the little horn that issued from the fourth one. One of the principal supporting arguments relied upon by preterists here is that the author of Daniel committed a historical blunder when he referred to Darius the Mede in chapter 5, verse 31 through chapter 6, verse 28 and 9:1. The argument runs as follows. Although no such figure is known from history, Daniel's reference to him thereby allowed for a separate Median kingdom between the Neo-Babylonian rulers found in H. Rowley's Darius the Mede and the Four Kingdoms, which is dedicated to the proposition of proving this historical error in order to sustain the preterist interpretation of the prophetic symbols. Rowley's classical conclusion is that there is no room in history for Darius the Mede. Unfortunately, he did not study the relevant cuneiform sources directly, but relied on secondary treatments of them. As I have pointed out in my study of the royal titles used in the Neo-Babylonian contract tablets written early in the reign of Cyrus, there is room in history for Darius the Mede, and the amount of room available for him is delimited quite precisely. The title King of Babylon was not used for Cyrus in the contract tablets dated to him during the first year after Babylon's conquest in October 539 BC. Only the title King of Lands was used for him, and this referred to him in his capacity as king of the Persian Empire. Late in 538 BC, however, the scribes added the title King of Babylon to his titulary, and it continued to be in use through the rest of his reign and those of his successors down to the time of Xerxes. There are only two possibilities here. Either there was an interregnum, I can't think, and the throne of Babylon went unoccupied for a year. Or somebody else besides Cyrus occupied the throne for that period of time. In my opinion, the prime candidate. Let's see, whoops. Okay. Late in 5. Okay, there are two possibilities. Cyrus occupied the throne for that period. In my opinion, the prime candidate for this other king of Babylon is Ugbaru, the general whose troops conquered Babylon for Cyrus. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, he appointed governors in Babylonia. See Daniel 6:1. And he resided in Babylon until he died there a year later, 1 month before the title King of Babylon was added to Cyrus's titulary. Ugbaru could have been reasonably well advanced in age by the time of his death, a circumstance which would fit with the age 62 for Darius the Mede in Daniel 5:31. Cuneiform sources do not provide us with any information about his father, Ahasuerus, or his ethnic origin as a Mede, Daniel 9:1. Darius could have been Ugbaru's throne name, as the use of throne names is known both in Babylon and Persia. The logical explanation why the dates in Daniel progress from the first year of Darius the Mede to the third of Cyrus is that Darius died in the interval. This harmonizes satisfactorily with the cuneiform evidence. Well, the case has not been proven conclusively for lack of direct reference to Darius the Mede in the cuneiform text. It should be kept in mind that by far the greater portion of Neo-Babylonian contract tablets are still unpublished. 18,000 of them from Sippar, for example, are in the British Museum. Even without the publication of those tablets, a reasonable hypothesis for him can be made out of the published tablets. One must also keep in mind how very fragmentary the picture of the past still is, which has been recovered thus far from the ancient Near East. Thus, the critical view that the author of Daniel blundered in identifying a Median king of Babylon has not been sustained by the historical sources of the 6th century BC. On the contrary, the detailed knowledge of the history of Babylon of this period being revealed in this and other passages in the book of Daniel argues strongly that the author was an eyewitness to those events. Lacking historical support for their interpretation of the second beast of Daniel 7, preterists must fall back on the interpretation of the symbols themselves. What has commonly been done here, as in the recent Anchor Bible volume on Daniel, is to amend the text by transposing the phrase about the 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear forward so that the ribs end up in the mouth of the lion instead. On the other hand, the phrases relating to a change in the lion are transferred to the bear. Thus, the bear receives the heart of a man and stands on his hind legs, not on one side. This altered bear is then supposed to refer to the only ruler of the fictitious Median kingdom that the author of Daniel presumably knew, Darius the Mede. In contrast to this garbling of history and of the text in support of a theory, the historicist interpretation of these symbols seems most reasonable. The raising up of the bear, first on one side and then on the other, can be seen quite naturally as a reference to the composite nature of the kingdom formed by a fusion of the Medes and the Persians. When left in the bear's mouth, the 3 ribs may reasonably be taken as representing the 3 major conquests of the combined forces of the Medes and Persians in the 6th century BC, Lydia in 547, Babylon 539, and Egypt in 525. Support for this interpretation in Daniel 7 can be found on the basis of the interpretation of the ram in Daniel 8. Its two disproportionate horns are specifically identified as the kings of Media and Persia, verse 20, expressing the same duality that is found in the prophet's view of the bear in chapter 7. The tripartite nature of the ram's conquest also parallels the three ribs in the mouth of the bear, since it expanded to the north, to Lydia, and to the west, Babylon, and to the south, Egypt. That would be comparing Daniel 7 and 8. The parallels between these two beasts in Daniel 7 and 8 support the interpretation of the former already arrived at from its context in Daniel 7. It's tying Daniel 7 to Daniel 8. And so namely that the bears represent Medo Persia. This means that the nondescript beast, the fourth in order there, must represent Rome. Therefore, the little horn that came from it cannot represent Antiochus the fourth. They want to import Antiochus into both chapters 7 and 8, it sounds like. From this conclusion about the little horn in Daniel 7, the next main question is, what is the relationship to the little horn in Daniel 8? Could the little horn in Daniel 8 still be Antiochus Epiphanes, even though the little horn in Daniel 7 does not represent him? Among historicist and futurist interpreters, there have been a significant number who have opted for different interpretations of these two figures. Virtually all of the pre-Millerite interpreters of the historicist school from the 18th and 19th centuries, referred to by L.E. Froom in volumes 3 and 4 of the Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, identified the little horn of Daniel 7 as the papacy. Only half of them then identified the little horn in Daniel 8 the same way. The other half interpreted it as Mohammedanism, Islam. A similar split can be seen among futurist interpreters of today. Some of them identify the little horn of Daniel 7 as the future Antichrist and the little horn of Daniel 8 as Antiochus. Thus, the possibility should be left open and not ruled out a priori that these two prophetic symbols could refer to different historical entities. On the other hand, there are significant arguments in favor of identifying the little horns in these two chapters as the same historical entity. First, the fact that the same symbol was used for both of them, whether in Aramaic in chapter 7 or in the Hebrew in chapter 8. Suggests at the outset that there could well be a connection between them, considering they're in different languages. If a historical distinction had been intended here, the best way would have been to use a different symbol, but the symbol remains the same. Second, the powers represented by the same prophetic symbol both engage in similar actions. Both appear to arise at somewhat similar time in history. Both begin small and become great. See 7:8 and 8:9. Though both are blasphemous powers, both persecute the saints of God, both appear to endure for protracted periods of prophetic time, 7:25, 8:14, and both eventually suffer similar fates. Thus, when two powers represented by the same prophetic symbol arise and carry out the same kinds of action in the same time slot in the flow of the visions, the probabilities appear to be on the side of those commentators who have identified them as the same historical entity. Some of the aspects of the work of the little horn in chapter 7 are not mentioned in chapter 8, and vice versa. The number of correspondence between them, however, is greater than those aspects of their work not mentioned in both passages. None of these individual characteristics are mutually exclusive, so as to rule out the possibility that they could refer to the same power. Third, the book of Daniel indicates that its later prophecies were intended to be explanations of its earlier prophecies. This is evident from their parallel order. The interpretations given in them that deal with the same world powers, their similar imagery, and their similar phraseology. Furthermore, the book itself specifically states this in at least two instances. Not only has the principle of amplification or expansion upon materials from earlier visions in the latter vision been recognized by virtually all commentators on the book, but it also provides a potential explanation for some of the differences between those prophecies. The prophecy conveyed by a dream in Daniel 2 is given primarily to Nebuchadnezzar, although the same vision was repeated to Daniel so that he could explain it to the king. He functioned essentially in that context as a wise man who interpreted the dream of the king. The vision of Daniel 7, on the other hand, was given directly and personally to Daniel half a century later. Consequently, Daniel came to serve God as a full-fledged prophet in his own right, being the first of four main prophecies given to Daniel. It is quite natural that the vision of chapter 7 stands out as the major outline of the future. Thus, all of the subsequent prophecies related to him can be seen as amplifying this main original prophetic outline. In this context, the vision of chapter 8 can be seen as an amplification of the vision of chapter 7. Even the date lines on the prophecies support that point. The visions of chapter 7 and 8 came together as one pair grouped 2 years apart. The prophecies of a more didactic nature in chapters 9 through 12 formed a unit as a second pair grouped 2 years apart. But the second pair of didactic prophecies came a decade later than the original pair of visionary prophecies. Thus, the vision of chapter 8 elaborates on the vision of chapter 7, while the explanations given in chapters 9 through 12 elaborate on the visions. Their explanations began already in chapter 7 and 8. This is another way of saying that all the prophetic imagery God wished to convey was in place by the time the vision of chapter 8 had been received. The final supplement to the basic vision had been given, and no further vision in terms of prophetic symbols were necessary. With the vision of chapter 8, standing in the relation to the vision of chapter 7, certain details of the basic vision could be further elaborated. Okay, I read that. Oh, no. It also means the other details did not have to be repeated. The clearest case of this comes from the fact that there is no beast to represent Babylon in Daniel 8. The common explanation is that the Neo-Babylonian Empire was drawing to a close, therefore it did not need to be represented again. This is not entirely accurate from the human point of view. The Haran inscriptions of Nabonidus state that he spent a decade at Tema in Arabia before returning to Babylon to defend it against the onslaught of Cyrus. The verse account of Nabonidus states that entrusted the kingship of Babylon to his son Belshazzar when he took off on that journey. It was early during this regency of Belshazzar in Babylon that Daniel received both of these visions. The precise date when Nabonidus returned to Babylon is not known, but it could not have been any later than 540 BC, the year before Babylon fell to the Persians. He could have returned there earlier, but this point cannot be determined with accuracy because of the damaged condition of Nabonidus' chronicle. We estimate, therefore, that the vision of chapter 7 was given to Daniel around 550 BC, and the vision of chapter 8 was given to him about 548 BC. Even by the time Daniel had received his second vision, Nabonidus still felt that his empire was sufficiently safe for him to spend another 7 years in Tema. Judging by the situation in Babylon at that time, it is not at all clear why I keep doing that. Okay. All right. In the light of this evidence, it seems reasonable to conclude that the treatment of the little horn in Daniel 8 should amplify the statement concerning the little horn in Daniel 7 rather than introduce another entity. The third line. Oh, wait, I've skipped some here. The information available from Daniel 7, bearing on the question as to whether the little horn of Daniel 8 should be identified as Antiochus Epiphanes, may now be summarized. First, the historicist's position identifying the fourth beast of Daniel 7 as Rome seems to be a sound one. This means that the little horn coming out of Rome cannot be Antiochus. If the little horn of Daniel 7 and N8 refer to the same historical entity, we must conclude that the little horn of 8 cannot be Antiochus either. Three important aspects support our conclusions. First, the same symbolic terminology is applied to both powers. Second, both are described as carrying out similar activities. And third, the general consideration of the later prophecies in the book of Daniel amplify his earlier prophecies. In the light of this evidence, it seems reasonable to conclude that the treatment of the little horn in Daniel 8 should amplify the statement concerning the little horn in Daniel 7 rather than introduce another entity. The third line of evidence noted above also explains why it was unnecessary to repeat in chapter 8 all the details of the vision in chapter 7. These three related aspects concerning the little horn in chapter 7 and 8 make it probable that both refer to the same historical entity, but they do not prove that point conclusively. In order to reach a more definitive position, we must study the little horn in the context of the chapter 8 vision itself. Furthermore, it will be necessary to relate it to information that is available from the later prophecies of Daniel.
can